Hello and welcome to the final of our Thinking Differently episodes. And today my guest is Kevin Clark, all the way from the US of A. Perhaps, Kevin, I might start, like always, with the question, well, so who is Kevin Clark and how did he become who he is today?
Well, first of all, thank you, and thank you for having me. Who is Kevin Clark? Kevin Clark is a former professor, former game designer, computer scientist, children's media producer, children's media maker, consultant, executive, an overall educator and connector. So I see myself as kind of a jack of all trades, master of none, and trying to help people.
And how, tell us about that journey, Kevin, from little Kevin to Kevin now. What happened for you to become the jack of all trades and the master of many things, I'm sure?
So I had an interest in education from an early start, and then I also became interested in computers. And so for me, combining the two seemed natural to me, but initially it was difficult because a lot of people didn't think that computers and education were things to be combined. And so I was fortunate to have really good mentors, really good people in my life to help me kind of navigate, and studied computer science and then got into programming and spent some time as a video game designer. And that opened me up to the world of entertainment media and children's media. And so once that happened, I then began to look into other forms of children's media in addition to games, and found myself in television. And really, it was because of my children. I had 2 young children at the time, and I wanted them to see more of themselves in the content that was being created. And so I started being a consultant to address some of those issues.
Our own children, we learn from them more, I think, than we think sometimes, yeah, when we observe those things. I think that certainly applies to me. Kevin, your experience, your personal experience of school, elementary school, and later on, tell us a little bit about that.
Right. So school for me was not, it wasn't inspiring, wasn't challenging. I was actually, we had low expectations. Low expectations were had of us. And I say we, I'm an identical twin, so I naturally speak in plurals most of the time. So please excuse me. But there were low expectations for us. And I remember a specific incident when we moved from New York City to the southern part of the country, North Carolina, and we were expected to repeat a grade. And because we were from an urban area, moving to a suburban area, and so we clearly must not have been prepared academically. But my grandmother, who was raising us, was a staunch advocate of education, and she loved her grandchildren. And she said, no, you will not put my children back. You will put them where they are supposed to be. And she demanded that they test us. And she said, whatever the test says, that's what we'll do. And so they tested us, and they ended up having to put us forward a grade. And so that was the first time I realized that I was not being pushed to my full potential. And so that was kind of the theme throughout my education. And to be honest, I just coasted for a lot of my elementary and even into high school. And then in university, I had to interview. I had to go through, which was odd or peculiar at that time. I had to interview to get in, and they, again, did not have confidence that I would do well. And I did well. I mean, I had a perfect GPA my first semester, and then I ended up graduating with a PhD, not from that university, but a PhD from another university. So I always feel like I'm proving myself, and people are underestimating me. And that's what I think about when I think about the school system. And the last thing I'll say is there was always a one-sided presentation of content. I always knew, and I always read and looked for content outside of the classroom, because I would say that can't be the whole story, and then I would go off and do research on the topics that we were discussing. So that's my experience in school.
There is a film clip on YouTube which I recommend everybody to watch. Really, it's called "The Fleas in the Jar." It's a science experiment, and it's about 2 or 3 minutes long. And if you put that in "fleas in the jar," it'll come up. And essentially what it shows, Kevin, is it shows fleas in a jar. The commentary then says, if we place a lid on the jar and we leave that lid there for 3 days, when we remove that lid, the fleas will never jump higher than where the lid was. And neither will their offspring. And I think the story that you've just told about the expectations that exist around where people come from, whether people are male or female, what ethnicity they are, what their socioeconomic context is. Clearly, we place people in boxes, and our experiences, if we're not very careful, then become according to the box or the jar that we're placed in. And I'm very pleased, and I'd like to tease that out a little bit more. When I ask children, and I travel all over the world, why do you go to school? The answer I get is because I have to, in 85% of the cases, which if you think about it, is a really sad answer. Yeah, but you started to allude like, well, so I checked things out of school, so I did things out of school. And when we come to your vast experience in terms of programming and gaming and all those things, how do you see that connect between the experiences out of school, and I include media and children's media in that, of course, and the quite narrow being taught that goes on in school? How do you see that, and what's your experience?
Yeah, so I think children, and me being included, have a natural curiosity. And so one of the things that I saw or learned early on is when a teacher would provide a lesson, I was the student that had 100 questions. Why? How? When? And the teacher would get frustrated, right? Because they had a lesson plan to go through and they wanted to get through it. And imagine that in stereo, right? Because my brother and I were often in the same class and we'd be asking the same questions. And so even though we may not have had people around us who could provide ready access to those questions or answers to those questions, we looked around. We talked to people. We went to the library, and then media also played a huge role, because when you can turn on the television or listen to the radio and hear something or see something that is reminiscent of you, your community, people you see, people you know, then it immediately you stop and you want to see more, you want to know more. And so growing up, when I began to see cartoons that featured Black people, I would just stop and look, or educational shows like Sesame Street and Electric Company, and that you would just stop and you say, I looked at that person, or that person looks like, someone that I know. And so, in the age prior to the internet, which is hard, my kids often don't believe that there was a time before the internet. And I said, before the internet, people looked at books and magazines. And so I was always the kid that was looking at magazines to find myself, to see what was happening in and around my community. And so I think media can and should play that role, because it allows us to get content to places where children reside. And children pretty much reside in 3 places. They're either at home, they're either at school, or they're either about in their community. And we know that media transcends all three of those areas. And so I think if we can deliver informative, engaging, and inspiring content to all of those areas of a child's life, then I think we have done something pretty amazing.
The community aspect fascinates me because, of course, now that community includes online, doesn't it? And all the brilliant things that come with it, and the challenges, of course, that come with that.
Yes, and in the community is oftentimes where we get that knowledge that isn't represented in textbooks, right? We learn about what's going on in the neighborhood. We hear the oral histories of the people in our families. And so oftentimes, when I was growing up, when the person died or moved away, that knowledge left. Or those stories did not continue. And so I think one of the attributes and benefits of media is that if those stories are captured and if that knowledge is put into a media format, then it continues and it can be shared across boundaries and across time. And
we can collect those, can't we? The kind of the reinvention of the Brothers Grimm,
yes.
via the media, I think is amazing. I suspect that one of the answers you're going to give me next is your grandmother, but I was going to ask you, in all of this that you've just described, as a youngster, what or who inspired you?
Yes. So yes, my grandmother would be number one. She was just an amazing woman. She had a number of foster kids, anywhere between 7 and 11 at a time. And then she had a set of identical twins who were very precocious. And all of us were in the same house. And she made sure that we were clothed, we were fed, and we were educated. And even though she was familiar with the schooling system, but did not go to a lot of schooling events, she knew how to make us do our homework. She knew how to make sure that we were getting what we needed from an educational standpoint. The second person that has also been an inspiration to me was my mentor when I went to college or university, and Dr. Wandra Hill. And she was the person who, even when I did not think I would be successful myself in college, she was the one who pushed me and had high expectations, and helped me see who I was, and stressed the importance of knowledge of self. And that was the first time where I began to make the connection between self-knowledge, education, and media. And the connection that I made was, if people are seeing themselves in the media that they consume, then it impacts all aspects of their life, from educational to social to economic. And so as a university student, she helped me understand how important it was to learn my history. She helped me understand how important it was for me to do well in school. And she also helped me understand how important it was to help others, and how the gifts that I was given should be used in positive and beneficial ways. So those are probably the two main people who have been inspirational to me.
If you look at the education systems as we have them now, what do you think is missing?
So I think the education system has an opportunity to connect those three places where children reside: home, school, and the community. And I think for a lot of the time, schools have focused on what happens in schools. We need to prepare children for the test. We need to prepare children to advance to the next level, when indeed what we should be focusing on is, how do we help children understand the world around them? How do we help children know who they are, their history, and the history of other people so that we get a clearer understanding of people's relationships and connections in the world. And so I think the way technology and media in particular can be helpful in the education of children is that, one, it can span those three places: home, school, and the community. Secondly, it can provide an opportunity for all people to have input and to provide their perspective on particular topics. For example, when you look at history, when history is taught in schools, it is taught from oftentimes a singular perspective, right? And so helping young people understand that singular perspective and also helping them understand, well, what are the other perspectives that may exist around that particular topic? It is for me reminiscent of an African proverb that I often hear and was popularized by Chinua Achebe, where he says, "Until the lion has its own historian, the story of the hunt will be told from the perspective of the hunter." We have a lot of stories that have been told from the hunter's perspective, and I think media can allow for multiple perspectives, and that could include the lions.
But I had a particularly brilliant history teacher in my secondary school, and he essentially and I wish I could do that now with the media and the whole internet stuff that sits around. He basically turned us into detectives. So he would turn up with today's newspaper and fix on a story and then ask, why is that happening? And that discovery side of things, rather than being taught, we start in the year zero and we'll see where we end up, kind of thing. I love that, and that's great.
And because as we live through history, we know that it doesn't happen the way it's taught, right? When we think about the historical events that we have lived through, they're not just a series of dates, right? We understand that there's context. There are a variety of perspectives. And when you ask people in different areas or from different backgrounds, they will have different perspectives. And so I think media allows us to tell those perspectives, to share those, whether it's visual media like movies, films, TV, or whether it's audio like podcasts or other formats.
There's an interesting thing I wanted to distinguish for the next question, really, between teaching and learning, because I think the learning is already doing this, but the teaching is not yet. And the question is around, why should the worlds of media and education work together? And now when I see my youngest daughter, the way she uses all sorts of media, it's already there. There are no more boxes. It flows, right? But in terms of the teacher and the planning and the national curriculum and everything else that goes with that, it is still very much either or. Now we're going to use a bit of media, and now we're going to do a bit of that. So what would your reasoning with the teaching side of things be to say, look, this has got to be better, this has got to go together?
Right. So if we're talking about really preparing young people to be productive citizens, which was essentially the goal of education way back, we need to understand that young people need to have all the tools that are available to them. And as you mentioned, young people are already using those tools outside of school. And so I think we have been reticent to use those tools in schools partly because of control. We're worried about how much we can control access to information, which is understandable. The other piece is sometimes people may not feel as comfortable using the technology in those settings because we have created a system that says you use this book for this course for this number of weeks, right? And so to then throw in the technology, which would get rid of kind of that system is a challenge. But I think as we begin to move forward, and we're having questions about AI, for example, and AI, love it or hate it, is coming. And we need to figure out from an education standpoint, how do we leverage the positive aspects of that particular technology for education, instead of saying, we're going to keep doing what we're doing and we're going to act like it's not here and we're not going to have to deal with it. Well, the reality is that we are going to have to deal with it. And so I think both from an educator training and professional development standpoint, as well as an instructional standpoint, I think we need to find ways to effectively and appropriately integrate technology and media into education, because I think we all will benefit from it, and we will prepare young people to be those productive citizens without them having to go through school and then they basically having to relearn everything because we didn't prepare them properly.
That's right. I also think that there's something else in there. My very good friend Carlo Rinaldi, who is the president of the Fondazione Reggio Children in northern Italy, always says that we must trust the children as much as they trust us. And I think that those dynamics are partly not working because of that control, which includes, I think, that trust question as well. Kevin, your work kind of crosses that divide really easily between education and media and gaming, everything that includes. I just wanted to touch on something that I experienced when I was Global Education Director for Kidzania, these cities where children experience the world of work. And the question I was asked more than any other question was the question, is it education or is it fun? So firstly, my answer would always be, well, why can't it be both? And then you go into all sorts of other reasons. You must have come across that, right?
Yes. When I first started, my first job out of grad school was as a video game designer. And we developed educational video games for what became the Sony PlayStation. And our goal was to develop educational content on a device that young people would want to play in addition to their regular entertainment grade video games. So it had to be fun. And so I think we often conflate or confuse education with not being fun. And if you, especially in informal settings, if you look at children in museums and in informal settings, they're having a blast. They're having loads of fun. They're learning, they're playing. Part of the problem is, one, we don't view play as educational, which we need to change that because play is very educational. And secondly, we need to not be so caught up on these artificial assessment measures that we put in media and in technology that doesn't make it fun. So we'll create a really cool video game, and then the video game will stop and say, okay, now we're going to take a test, which breaks the flow of the game, which does not make it fun. Whereas instead of making a test, why don't you just see if they get to the next level? If they get to the next level of the game, then that tells you that they understand the content or have figured out a way around the content, which is probably even smarter than learning the content. And so I think we have to have new ways of thinking about assessment. We have to have new ways of thinking about what is fun and what is learning. Learning includes play. Learning includes sharing. Learning includes observation. And so we need to think about all of those as we look at how we deliver instruction and education to young people.
Perfect. Kevin, the final question, which is, what one thing would you like our viewers to take away from the conversation that you and I have had today?
Which the one thing, I guess, is when we talk about education and media, and I alluded to this earlier, and that is we need to have more stories by the lion, more perspectives. And the way we do that is building capacity and enabling small production companies, storytellers, looking at innovative ways of distributing content. And I think when we have those variety of stories and those variety of approaches, that will begin to provide young people with the education and learning that they deserve through a variety of platforms, which includes media technology and as well as print.
And there is, Kevin, one more thing I would like our viewers to take away, which is that you will be joining us, and you and I together will be at the Children's Media Conference 2024 from the 9th to the 11th of July in my hometown of Sheffield, where we will be guiding and moderating Thinking Differently with the audience to hopefully further levels.
Yes, and I'm really excited about this because to be a part of Thinking Differently and working with children's media content creators and people in the business to begin to have these really important discussions around the role of media in education and learning. So I'm looking forward to joining you in Sheffield in 2024.
So am I. In the meantime, Kevin, thank you so much for being with us today and for a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.